Right now, in January 2026, the streets of Iran are on fire. Thousands of protesters are risking everything, chanting death to the dictator while facing live bullets from security forces. President Trump is threatening military strikes. China is warning against foreign interference, and the entire nation of Iran is plunged into darkness with an unprecedented internet blackout hiding what could be one of the deadliest crackdowns in recent history. This isn't just another protest, this is a nation at a breaking point, and the world is watching to see if this regime can survive. Stay with me as we break down exactly what's happening, why it matters, and what could happen next. Picture this. Late December 2025, Tehran's historic Grand Bazaar, the heart of Iran's economy for centuries, suddenly goes silent. Shopkeepers, the same merchants who helped bring the Islamic Revolution to power back in 1979, are now shuttering their shops in protest. Why? Because the Iranian currency, the rial, has completely collapsed. We're talking about trading at over 1.4 million rials to $1, but here's where it gets explosive. What started as merchants complaining about prices quickly evolved into something far more dangerous for the regime. Within days, the protests spread like wildfire across all 31 of Iran's provinces. The Iranian government's response has been absolutely brutal. Security forces, including the elite Revolutionary Guards, have opened fire on crowds with live ammunition. Rights groups Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have documented at least 28 deaths in just the first few days between December 31st and January 3rd. But as the protests continued and intensified, those numbers skyrocketed. US-based human rights activist news agency, which has a network inside Iran and has been accurate in past crackdowns, reports that more than 500 people have been killed, with 579 additional deaths still under investigation. That could bring the total to over 1,100 deaths. But the government went even further. On January 8th, they did something unprecedented. They shut down the entire internet across Iran. We're talking about a communications blackout on a scale never seen before in the country. Mobile networks disrupted. Social media blocked. People inside Iran are completely cut off from the outside world. Why? Because the regime knows that the world is watching. Now let's talk about President Donald Trump, because he's not sitting quietly on this one. Trump, fresh into his second term after being inaugurated on January 20th, 2025, sees an opportunity here. On January 2nd, he posted on Truth Social with a typo that got everyone's attention. He wrote, "If Iran shots and violently kills peaceful protesters, which is their custom, the United States of America will come to their rescue." Then on January 9th, he escalated dramatically. Trump declared the US was locked and loaded and ready to go if Iranian security forces continued killing demonstrators. He said Iran would be hit very hard, at levels they've never been hit before. What does that mean? According to reports, Trump's national security team is briefing him on military options. We're talking about precision drone strikes targeting Revolutionary Guard bases, cyber attacks to disable Iran's communications and defense systems, and possibly more. Remember, Trump has done this before. Back in January 2020, he authorized the drone strike that killed Qasem Soleimani, Iran's most powerful military commander. Trump doesn't make empty threats, and the Iranian regime knows it. Retired US General Jack Kane said on Fox News, "If I was in the Iranian regime, I would take President Trump dead serious here." But Trump's not alone in his response. The international community is speaking up, though with very different messages. On January 9th, the leaders of France, Germany, and the United Kingdom released a joint statement urging Iran to exercise restraint. Notice they said restraint, not stop killing protesters. It's diplomatic language that shows concern but doesn't go as far as Trump. Australia, Canada, and the entire European Union condemned Iran's use of force against protesters. The United Nations criticized the internet shutdown and violation of. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen went even further, calling for the release of imprisoned protesters and saying Europe stands fully behind those demonstrating. Even author J.K. Rowling weighed in, calling the bravery of Iranian protesters astounding and a light in a dark world. But here's where it gets really interesting geopolitically. China and Russia, Iran's main allies, are sending very different messages. On January 5th, China's Foreign Ministry spokesman Lin Jian said, "Beijing stands firmly against external interference in the internal affairs of Iran." He called on all parties to do more things for peace and stability in the Middle East, but made it crystal clear that China opposes any foreign intervention. Then, on January 13th, Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Mao Ning doubled down, saying China always opposes interference in other countries' internal affairs and opposes using or threatening to use force in international relations. China is essentially telling Trump back off or risk a major diplomatic crisis. Why does China care? Because Iran supplies China with heavily discounted oil through their 25-year comprehensive strategic partnership worth $400 billion. If the Iranian regime falls or if the US intervenes militarily, China loses that cheap oil supply at a time when they desperately need it. Russia also doesn't recognize the UN sanctions that were restored against Iran in September 2025. Moscow has its own strategic partnership with Iran signed in early 2025. But here's just the reality. Neither China nor Russia has provided overt military support to Iran during this crisis. They're worried about economic interests and stability, but they're not willing to risk direct confrontation with the United States over this. In fact, just days ago, Iran, Russia, and China conducted naval drills off the coast of South Africa called Will for Peace 2026. But South African officials had to clarify this was planned long before the current tensions. Turkey's response is fascinating because Ankara and Tehran have been regional rivals for decades. Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan gave an interview where he acknowledged the protests send a very strong message to the regime and said he is sure the regime will get it. But Fidan also noted that the protests are being manipulated by Iran's rivals from abroad, specifically mentioning that Israel's Mossad is openly calling on Iranians to revolt through their social media accounts. Turkey supports an agreement between Iran and the West, particularly the Americans, because they believe regional stability depends on it. Turkish President Erdogan has even offered to mediate. But Turkey is walking a tightrope. They find the economic grievances legitimate, but they can't align with Israeli and US calls to topple the government without damaging their own relationship with Iran. Meanwhile, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is watching all of this with satisfaction. On January 4th, Netanyahu said Israelis identify with the struggle of the Iranian people and suggested it was quite possible the protests marked a moment when Iranians were taking their fate into their own hands. Remember, Israel and the United States conducted a devastating 12-day military campaign against Iran back in June 2025, bombing nuclear facilities in Fordo, Isfahan, and Natanz. Israel killed many of Iran's top military commanders during those strikes. Netanyahu has now said in January 2026 that Israel will not allow Iran to re-establish its missile or nuclear programs. The message is clear: if Iran tries to rebuild, Israel will strike again. Inside Iran, the regime is fighting for survival. Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, who has ruled Iran with absolute authority since 1989, gave a speech on Friday where he said the Islamic Republic came to power with the blood of hundreds of thousands of honorable people, and it will not back down in the face of saboteurs. He called protesters vandals and rioters and said they must be put in their place. Khamenei also took aim at Trump directly, saying Trump's hands are stained with the blood of more than 1,000 Iranians, referring to Israel's June attacks that the US supported. Iran's Chief Justice Gholam Hossein Mosaddegh ordered prosecutors to show no leniency to protesters and to expedite their trials. He said anyone participating in protests was operating in line with the enemies of the Islamic Republic. The Speaker of Parliament, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, threatened that Iran will attack all US bases in the Middle East if the US military strikes Iran. These aren't idle threats. Iran has dozens of ballistic missiles capable of reaching US bases in Iraq, Syria, Qatar, and Bahrain. They have proxy militias across the region: Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, Shia militias in Iraq. If this turns into open conflict, it could explode into a regional war. But here's the crack in the regime's armor. President Masoud Pezeshkian, who was elected in 2024 on promises of good governance and reform, admitted in a televised broadcast that we are at total war with Israel, Europe, and the United States of America. He said if we do not resolve the issue of people's livelihoods, we will end up in hell. The international response has had real-world consequences. Starting January 9th, multiple airlines suspended all flights to Iran. Turkish Airlines canceled 17 flights between Istanbul and Iranian cities including Tehran, Tabriz, and Mashhad. Turkish carriers Ajet and Pegasus suspended all services. UAE carriers Flydubai and Emirates halted flights. Qatar Airways canceled flights from Doha. Even Austrian Airlines and Lufthansa canceled their routes. These aren't just symbolic gestures. When airlines stop flying to your country, it signals to the world that the situation is too dangerous, that your government has lost control. It isolates Iran further, both economically and diplomatically. So what happens next? There are really three possible scenarios playing out. First scenario, negotiations. Trump has hinted that Iran reached out through back channels. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi wrote an op-ed in The Guardian calling for the US to reopen negotiations. If both sides decide they'd rather talk than fight, we could see a new nuclear deal. Sanctions relief in exchange for Iran limiting its nuclear program and perhaps easing the crackdown on protesters. This would be the least destructive option, but it requires both Trump and Khamenei to back down. And neither man is known for backing down. Second scenario, military intervention. Trump follows through on his threats. The US launches precision strikes on Revolutionary Guard facilities, cyber attacks that blind Iran's defense systems, maybe even special operations to support protesters. Israel joins in to prevent Iran from rebuilding its nuclear program. Iran retaliates by attacking US bases across the Middle East, firing missiles at Israel, activating Hezbollah and Houthi proxies to launch attacks. Oil prices skyrocket as the Strait of Hormuz, through which 20% of the world's oil flows, becomes a war zone. Gas prices in America hit $6 a gallon. The global economy takes a massive hit. Thousands die in the conflict. This is the nightmare scenario that keeps world leaders up at night. Third scenario, the status quo grinds on. The regime manages to brutally suppress the protests through mass arrests, executions, and overwhelming force. The internet blackout continues, hiding the worst of the violence from the world. Sanctions tighten further, strangling what's left of Iran's economy. The protesters eventually exhaust themselves, demoralized by the brutal crackdown. But the underlying problems, the economic collapse, the corruption, the lack of freedom, all of that remains. Iran becomes even more of a pressure cooker, with another explosion inevitable down the line. The regime survives, but in a weakened, isolated, increasingly desperate state. There's also a wild card scenario that some analysts are quietly discussing. Could this be Iran's 1979 moment all over again, but in reverse? Back then, mass protests toppled the Shah and brought the Islamic Republic to power. Could these protests actually succeed in overthrowing Khamenei and the entire clerical regime? Some protesters are chanting support for Reza Pahlavi, the exiled son of the last Shah, though he himself says he wants a referendum to let Iranians decide their future government. But here's the problem. Even if protesters somehow manage to topple the regime, what comes next? Iran is a complex country of 90 million people with diverse ethnic groups: Persians, Kurds, Azeris, Arabs, Baloch. Would it transition to democracy? Would it fracture into ethnic conflicts? Would it descend into chaos like Libya or Syria after their revolutions? Nobody knows, and that uncertainty terrifies regional powers. What we do know is this: the situation is escalating. Every day brings new reports of deaths, new arrests, new threats from both sides. Trump is scheduled to be briefed again on military options. The internet blackout means we don't know the full scale of what's happening inside Iran, and that's exactly what the regime wants. But information is still leaking out, videos smuggled through VPN. The Iranian people have reached a breaking point after decades of repression, economic mismanagement, and corruption. They're not just asking for reform anymore. They're demanding the entire system change. And the world is divided on how to respond. The United States, Israel, and some European leaders see an opportunity to weaken or even topple a regime they view as a threat to regional stability. China and Russia want to preserve their ally and their economic interests. Middle Eastern countries like Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE are watching nervously, worried about instability spreading. And the Iranian people themselves are caught in the middle, fighting for their future while their government fights for its survival. This is history unfolding in real time. Whether this ends in negotiation, military conflict, brutal suppression, or revolutionary change, the consequences will reshape the Middle East for decades to come. The decisions made in the next days and weeks in Washington, Tehran, Beijing, Tel Aviv will determine whether we're headed for diplomacy or disaster. Right now, the streets of Iran are burning, Trump's finger is on the trigger, and the world is holding its breath. What comes next could change everything. Your support helps us continue to bring these important stories to light. Stay informed and stay engaged.